The opening joke goes like this. It's not really that funny, but, you know, I'll tell it anyway. So the joke goes, a guy goes into a tailor shop to buy a suit. And he's looking at all the different materials, a very beautiful material, very beautiful textiles and cuts and colors and so on. But the prices are all really too high. So the salesman says, well, how much do you have to spend? He says, well, I have 50 bucks. 50 bucks, we can help you out, no problem. Brings out a suit, says, here, try this on. Goes into the change room, comes back out. And he says, what do you think? And he says, you know, I love it, Doc. It's really nice. I mean, the color brings out my eyes and so on. But the only problem is that I noticed that one sleeve is quite a bit longer than the other. He says, no problem. All you have to do is sort of stand sideways and hike up one sleeve. He says, oh, you know, that does that, Doc. That's good. And he says, and there's just one other thing. I noticed that one of the legs of the pants is also quite a bit longer. He says, no problem. Just sort of crouch down and stick out that leg a bit, and it'll be fine. So he says, you know, it actually works. So he pays for the suit. He walks out, and he's walking along the street like this. And across the street, there's Sam and Madge, and Sam says to Madge, Madge, look at that guy walking down the street in such a funny way. And Madge says, yeah, but look how good his suit fits. Thank you. I'll let that sink in a little bit there. Tonight's lecture, of course, brings the fall semester to a close. And it's a bit of a cliffhanger because we're going to wrap up some of the themes that we discussed and look towards the spring semester where we will be focusing on the Sephardic diaspora. Sephardic life in the Iberian Peninsula ends at the end of the 15th century, 1492 in Spain, and then 1497 in Portugal. But next semester, in February, we're going to look at those places where the Sephardim spread. We'll be able to trace them by following the establishment of Chinese restaurants all across the Mediterranean basin, and then we'll see how resilient and remarkable this ethnic subgroup of the Jewish people is. It's an amazing story that I'm getting a tremendous amount of personal chizuk, personal encouragement from learning more about them. Let's do a little bit of good and welfare. Tonight's lecture, by the way, is a little bit of a quirky lecture compared to most of them. You know, I focus primarily on biographies, and we have to do a bit of a biographical spin today because we're going to look at one specific question: was Christopher Columbus Jewish? It's not such a simple question. There are some relevant material. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by Christopher and Anne-Marie Bray. They sponsored actually a series of lectures right after Hurricane Irma, and they dedicated it to the merit of the people who were harmed by that hurricane. Unfortunately, we had other hurricanes afterwards, Hurricane Harvey and so on, that were quite devastating. It's been a very tough year that way, but we're grateful to them. We will be opening up sponsorships for the spring lectures. There will be 12 lectures, God willing, starting in February, and just pay attention to your email for those connections. If you're not receiving the emails, visit my website, henryabramson.com or jewishhistorylectures.org, and you can sign up there and get the free irritating email reminders. A quick look, since this is the end of our calendar year, I usually do a quick analysis to see how we did in terms of the overall series. Pretty nicely, I think. Our subscribers are up overall. We got about 15,000 people watch these lectures every week. They're subscribing on YouTube or on Facebook or on LinkedIn, places like that. We're down one country. We used to have 214 countries last year. I didn't go and figure out which country dropped out. I have a feeling it was probably I don't know. No, Israel is actually one of the big popular countries. I'll have to check it out. 60% of our viewers are from the States. The other 40% are international. Latvia, well, it was a slow year for Latvia. They're down 25%. I think they only have 201 viewers this year. But as you can see from the chart, this is where we were. This is a number of views per day. When we started giving these lectures in Miami back in 2012, this is when I moved to New York, and thank God the lectures are really gaining popularity, so I'm really very pleased with it. This is actually a statistic I'm proud of. The average view duration, most of the lectures are about 50 minutes online, 50. So we have the average view duration of 15 minutes and 31 seconds, which is pretty impressive. It means that people on average are watching for about 15 minutes. That's actually an impressive statistic within the YouTube universe. That's up from 1441 from the year before. being a professional teacher and watching my students fall asleep, I know that number means a lot, you know? Okay. We have a new channel. This year we were invited to participate in Torah Anytime, which is probably one of the most important websites for Torah content in the Jewish world, one of them at any rate. They have a great slogan, God's reason for the internet. So I'm proud to be with them. One of the nice things about their site is, and this is something really good for a lot of yeshiva guys who don't watch videos, but they really like to hear shiurim, they like to hear classes. You can actually just listen or even download and play it while you're driving and things like that. I think they have an app as well, so that's a nice thing this year. Also, really cool, I'm really pleased that I was invited to lead a trip into Portugal and Spain as a result of this series, specifically on the Sephardic Jews. So that's going to be a really nice thing this summer. You can check out that website if you're interested. And finally, most importantly, you know, I give these lectures just for the sheer value of discussing the contribution to world civilization that the Jews represent. I think it adds meaning to both Jewish existence, and I think it has tremendous value for non-Jews as well, so that gives me great pleasure. But I love to have money coming in, because then I can give it to my undergraduate students in the form of scholarships. So your presence here and you're watching on the internet is participation sufficient, and I'm very happy with that. But if you have some excess money lying around and you want to give it to a valuable cause and support our students, this is a great choice. Here is the website, bit.ly at the Friends of Jewish History. Okay, that's it for good and welfare. Tonight's lecture is going to rely very heavily on the research of Rabbi Dr. Meyer Kaiserling. He wrote a work which was translated into English, which was helpful, on specifically the biography of Christopher Columbus and his connection to the Jews. It was published back in, I think, 1896, and no one has done this work since. This is, I think, a great PhD thesis for anyone out there who's looking for a graduate topic. It's 100 years since anyone looked at this question, and it is a fascinating question. When I did my initial research and I just kind of wandered around the web, I see that people are still writing about this in the popular media today. There's a lot of fascinating material, and so we're going to rely heavily on his research. Even though it's 100 years old, it's still got some freshness to it and some vitality. He was a rabbi who was associated with the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, kind of a secularizing approach to Jewish culture that saw much of the religious activity in a historical bent, a student of Leopold Zunz. More familiar to this audience, he was a student of Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch as well, served as a rabbi in Switzerland and later in Budapest, Hungary. Okay, so here the big question is, was Christopher Columbus Jewish? What is the Hava Amina? What is the presumption that one would think he was Jewish? This is the best portrait we have of him. It was made posthumously by some 10, 15 years, if I remember correctly. We don't even know exactly what he looked like. And we are talking about the end of the 15th century. Plastic arts are very well developed. Portraiture is very developed. This is one of those great figures who was obviously pivotal in world history. We talk about the Columbian Exchange, the whole globalization that is still something we live with today and are grappling with today in our economies and our cultures. It's all a result of Columbus's bold decision to try and find the Indies, and he ended up stumbling across America, of course. There's a lot more complexities to that story, which we will not go into, but he's an enigmatic character. And the Jewish aspect of him is really quite fascinating. So the question, so was Christopher Columbus Jewish? The answer is, to give it away, we can all go home right now, probably not. It is highly unlikely that he was in fact Jewish. But still, we still have the question, why wouldn't one think so? Let us just quickly look at the work of Cecil Roth. We actually studied his work earlier. He wrote several books on the history of the Inquisition and the experience of Jews in late 15th century Spain. He wrote about Columbus that the mystery regarding Columbus's origins is largely the outcome of his own mendacity, meaning Columbus himself enjoyed projecting the image that he was secretly Jewish. It was kind of like a chutzpah kind. So anyways, his own mendacity, meaning he used to lie. He used to dissuade. He used to, try to put it in people's faces like, don't mess with me because I have Jewish blood. He would say like, do you know who I am? I descend from King David. He would say things like this. He would write things like this. And he openly cultivated this kind of mystique surrounding his lineage that he hoped would add to his own grandeur. There are many characters like this you see in Jewish history. Another good example of someone who actually was ethnically Jewish would be, for example, Benjamin Disraeli, who was baptized and lived his life as a Christian, but he really enjoyed throwing it in the faces of his parliamentary interlocutors that he in fact was Jewish, and he had a unique kind of skill and a unique kind of logic that they had no access to. So he played up this quite a bit, and we shall see some of them. But since Columbus frequently made these references, and his background is incredibly murky, Roth concludes, as a result, it is equally impossible to exclude or to confirm the hypothesis that he was descended from a Jewish or an ex-Jewish family. In other words, probably not, but there's enough nagging doubts that at least we can talk about it for half an hour or so. Let's look at those nagging doubt issues. So here we go. The first of all, his surname. We say Columbus in English, but it would be Colon. He also signed his name as Colom, Christophe Colomb. This was a common Italian name. Italian Jewish name, excuse me. So used quite often by Italian Jews. He could connect himself to many Italian Jewish families. There's quite a bit of dispute as to whether or not he came from Italy. He refers to himself as coming from Genoa or Genoa. Also, there's documents that indicate he may have come from Majorca, even documents that he may have come from Poland, which is another possibility for this Jewish origins, but none of them are really very reliable. Quite likely he may have come from Sicily. So the last name is something. The first name, definitely not. Christopher, of course, means bearer of Christ, one who carries Christ. So that's not a typical Jewish name, just like Mary. As I mentioned earlier, Columbus loved making references to his Jewish origins, in person and in writing. This is kind of like a dangerous thing to do because we're living in a period when the conversos are being actively persecuted, and at the same time he was kind of like a transitional liminal figure that was moving in and out of many royal courts from Portugal and Spain, Italy, elsewhere, trying to gain support for his venture, and whatever he thought would make himself look more exotic and more appealing in his request, he would not hesitate to use. But nevertheless, that's part of it. Third, we know he had a lot of Jewish friends. He had a tremendous amount of associations with Jews. He was very close with Abraham Zacuto in Portugal. You recall we spoke about him for an hour a few weeks ago. And he relied very heavily on Zacuto's astronomical research. The astrolabe that Zacuto had refined by making it out of metal was incredibly important to Columbus, as was the Alphonsine tables that were translated through Hebrew into Latin for him. He had many Jews on his ship. We're not precisely sure because we only have like the ship manifests. They're not complete, and they have surnames. Very many of them we simply don't know what the biographies of them are. We do know that his translator was Jewish. This is, by the way, a typical kind of Jewish profession. Jews in medicine, Jews in law, Jews in finance, and Jews in linguistics are very big. Jews, the exception of American Jewry, it's a very unusual exception, 20th century American Jewry, very monolingual, but for the most part, Jews typically are polyglots, speaking several languages and very valuable to their host societies as a result. I have a feeling that might be because Jews tend to exist on the outsides of mainstream society. In America, where we were accepted so well and so deeply, especially in the second half of the 20th century, we lost a lot of our linguistic skill because it was not necessary. But in the first half of the 20th century and earlier, perhaps in the later 21st century, we will develop that again. Hard to say. He was also very close to conversos, that is, Jews who had converted to Christianity during the course of the Inquisition. In particular, de Santagel, who was one of his main economic backers, a very important person in the royal court of Isabel and Ferdinand, who supported him and made crucial recommendations to allow the king and queen to promote his work. And a man named Sanchez as well, another major backer. And in fact, when he actually discovered the New World and he returned back and landed in the coast of Africa, he immediately sent letters describing his discovery to the king and queen. Obviously, he couldn't send letters back from the New World because the postal service was not too great, connecting transcontinental messages. But he did not address those letters to the king and queen. He sent them to his Jewish buddies, or his converso buddies, de Santagel and Sanchez. Very unusual that they would be the first people he writes to. There are some really tantalizing things, like, for example, he was the ships, and by the way, you should recall that he spent about a decade petitioning wealthy kingdoms to back his enterprise, pushing for his idea, bouncing from state to state, spent a lot of time in Portugal, no luck there, eventually ended up in Spain and got a positive yes from Isabel and Ferdinand, and the ships were completely outfitted in the first week of the month of Av, and he was ready to go on Tisha B'Av of 1492, and he delayed it one day. Even though everything was set to go, but since that is an inauspicious day in the Jewish calendar for travel, one does not embark on major journeys of any type on Tisha B'Av. For reasons that no one can really adduce, he decided to push off this highly anticipated departure for the day after. He wanted to not leave on Tisha B'Av, perhaps. Then we have lots of things that he himself said in his own writings, like his journal of his trip to America, which of course was a very celebrated work, began with the sentence, "On the day that the Jews were expelled from Spain, I set out for the New World." I mean, the very first clause of the very first sentence of his journal references the Jews and their situation in the Iberian Peninsula. A remarkable kind of way to begin this document. It doesn't begin that something like, "I knew I would find land." It begins with, "The Jews were expelled from Spain." Let's have a look at some of his personal correspondence. Here's one of the few letters that we have in his own hand that he wrote to his son Diego. There's a whole story about what happens after he discovers the New World. He ends up kind of dying in disgrace and madness and not having any credit. And so we do have a lot of material from after the discoveries as well. This is one of those letters. And you'll see on the top left corner, there's this funny little squiggle right where the arrow is, right where the cursor is, you see over here, that is not part of the letter text itself. And looks a little bit like he's testing out the ballpoint on his pen. But of course, this is about 400 years before they invented ballpoints. So what exactly is that? Some scholars have opined that it looks something like the traditional invocation at the beginning of a Hebrew letter. The letter is Beit Hey. I didn't have my computer easy access to handwritten letters. Like, you would look a little different if you wrote them by script rather than in the Assyrian block script like this. But in fact, you can conceivably see you've got the Beit on the right and the Hey on the left in a cursive script, which is an abbreviation for the term Baruch Hashem, or blessed is the name, which reminds me of a joke that I will try to tell you right after this. So the signing the beginning of his letters with this strange little swiggle, and by the way, he only did it in his letters to his sons. He didn't write it to other people. So just as a family thing, perhaps then is Baruch Hashem. And you may be asking, but it's on the wrong side of the page. You know, what do you want from him? He's pretending anyways. I don't know. It's true. Normally you would write this on the right-hand side of the page, but it's not at all uncommon to see it at the center at top as well. So what would be terrible if he puts it on the left? You know, it doesn't even look very neat, but, you know, neither does his Castilian there, too. One last detail from this same letter. He developed this rather unusual signature that he was very particular about. You can just see it here. I have another copy that shows it in a little bit greater contrast here. No one has yet been able to decipher this strange signature that not only did he use in the latter years of his life, but he insisted that his children also use this signature, which is a strange kind of thing to do. You know, I want you to sign my name like I sign this name, you know, not on checks or something like that. This part we can sort of figure out. The X is, of course, the Greek chi letter, as in Christos, and this is the Greek R and the Greek O, so Christo, this is a short form for Christopher, let's say, or just for Christo at any rate. And then Ferenz is a Latinized version of the fur part in Christopher, meaning the one who bears Christ, right? Christos, Ferenz, Christopher. So that part is easy. But what's the business with this, either the Latin letter X or the Greek letter chi, an M and a Y, which could be an U, and the SAS with those two dots around the S's, which he insisted on being written exactly like this, in this shape, and so on. Cecil Roth, a major historian who we saw a little while ago, he argued, not specifically, not really convincingly, but nevertheless it's worth noting, that this is kind of like a secret symbol to his sons, that they should say Kaddish for him after he died. The conversos did definitely use a lot of secret messages that they handed down in all kinds of coded forms to their children. Do this behavior to remind you of a particular mitzvah that we have to keep, and so on. So it's not at all impossible, but it's difficult to see this in his signature. Nevertheless, you take all of these things together, and you know, you can add it up for yourself. It's hard to believe that he was actually Jewish. I think it's more likely that he liked the image of being Jewish, and he actively cultivated that with his population. And that's about it for the real question on was Christopher Columbus Jewish? I pause for questions. And I have to tell you the joke. He cultivated relationships of various types, social relationships with Jews, which was very common, of course, for the conversos, and was also at the heart of the Inquisition, the fact that the conversos did not make a sharp break with Judaism, that they stayed in the Jewish community, would go back to the Jewish community for shiurim, for Chinese food, all kinds of things. So his behavior pattern fit with the converso type of attitude. Professor? Yes, he did write occasionally in Hebrew. Not, you know, not whole sentences, but, you know, he picked up a little bit of Hebrew, and he would actually indicate words. There's all kinds of, there must be 20 bizarre little cues in his own journals and writings and things like that, including somewhat fanciful Hebrew origins for the place names that he discovered in the New World. But they're all kind of like on the bizarre end of credibility. Okay. Let me tell you the joke before I forget. It's the end of the semester. We're going to have a long break. We'll meet again in February, so I can squeeze in a couple of jokes. You look a little bit skeptical, but it's a good one. It really is. So a guy goes to buy a used car, and he doesn't have a lot of money. He's wearing a suit that fits great, although he has to walk in a funny way. He goes in to buy this car, and he explains to the car dealer that he has a large family and a very low budget, and he puts a lot of money into day school tuition for his kids. Does he have some way to help him out? And he says, sure, I've got this car for you. Shows him this old beat-up station wagon, you know, with the fake wooden paneling on the side, country squire. and big V8 engine inside. And he says, you know, the price is right, and I think I could fit all of my kids in this, but I'm a little worried because I noticed there's no gas pedal and there's no brake pedal. I mean, how do you make this go? So the dealer says, this is a very special car. If you want it to go, you have to say, Baruch Hashem. You know, like we saw that earlier, the phrase Baruch Hashem. Blessed is the name, which means, you know, and which is, by the way, a common phrase. I'm sure all of you in the audience use this phrase, meaning, hello, how are you? I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Baruch Hashem, right? He says, that's fascinating. And he said, how do you make it slow down? He says, you want to slow down, you say Shema Yisrael, right? Hear, O Israel. He says, okay, this is great. So he buys the car. He's driving off the lot. Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. The car is moving very nicely, and he's so pleased. He's going to bring it home. He's thinking about how he'll show his wife and his father-in-law, the Shver, will be so happy, and Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. Then all of a sudden he realizes he forgot the phrase to make it slow down. And the car keeps picking up speed, and he doesn't know what to do, and he's honking the horn, and he's going through red lights, and he gets in a one-way street the wrong way, and he's really desperate. He doesn't know what to do, and honking the horn. And suddenly he breaks through a construction barrier, and he realizes he's on an on-ramp to a bridge under construction. And the bridge doesn't make it to the other side. So he realizes this is going to be the end of his life. It's tragic. But like any good Jew, since he's at the end of his life, he has to take that last step and proclaim, you know, the unity of God's name, covers his eyes and says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and the car stops right at the precipice. He takes his hand off and he says, Baruch Hashem. Right. Somebody go figure that out. Okay. Let us go on to, now, let us place ourselves, because we touched on this subject really of Christopher Columbus being Jewish, but let us focus on what's really the important part of the history here, which is the experience of the Jews in the late 15th century and what were their options. Here's a photograph of an auto da fe, a burning of conversos in the early 16th century in Lisbon, Portugal. The auto da fe's were scattered throughout the entire peninsula as you'll recall the situation was that, well, let's actually go through the way I planned it here. So first of all, these are the options that Jews had in the last decade of the 15th century. The first option was to remain in situ as a crypto-Jew. In other words, as a hidden Jew. Obviously, they could convert to Christianity and simply blend in, and that happened for a large number of families. We don't have really good population statistics, but possibly 200,000 Jews left the Iberian Peninsula. That was likely a fraction of the total number who remained. So it would not be unreasonable to speak about 200,000 Jews remaining in Spain, and the majority of them through conversion, and a small number of them secretly practicing Judaism to one degree or another. We do know that over the course of the next 200 years, converso families are leaving Spain and Portugal and moving to places like Amsterdam, and then, as it were, rediscovering their roots or re-expressing themselves as Jews. So we're talking about, you know, tens of thousands of people who made these various choices. The first choice is to remain as a crypto-Jew. This is, of course, the polite term for what you could call converso, meaning someone who converted to another faith, or the term New Christian, which was used by Spaniards to refer to those Christians who came from Jewish backgrounds. The term Marrano is, of course, derogatory. It means swine, and it was not a term they would have used for themselves. It also refers to people called anusim, literally forced, meaning they were forced to convert, and they chose the route of hiding their religious identity to save themselves. But remaining as crypto-Jews was extremely difficult. First of all, there was a tremendous cloud of suspicion that hung over their heads for generations. You could not simply, you know, accept a trip to the baptismal font and then your life would go on as normal. You were constantly scrutinized by your neighbors, especially once Ferdinand and Isabella got into the habit of rewarding those who unmasked conversos with their confiscated property. So you always had neighbors looking in at you, literally, what's cooking in the kitchen? Or they're making lasagna. Are they adding cheese and meat to the same meal? I noticed that they haven't been slaughtering any porks in their backyard lately. Any pork, excuse me. It reminds me of another joke. Why am I thinking of so many jokes today? I noticed that they haven't been slaughtering any swine, so maybe they're actually keeping kosher and so on. And there are all kinds of stories of like lighting the candles, putting them under the table, or putting them in a closet during the Sabbath, things like that. You were literally always under suspicion for generations. Your children, your grandchildren would always be suspected of being conversos. And if they were denounced, then they could easily be brought to a tribunal, subject to horrific tortures. If found guilty, they could be forced to wear penitential gowns and then endure a variety of punishments, which many times culminated into the auto da fe, the public burning. In some cases, especially dealing with landed estates where there's a lot of wealth involved, the state would make that trial in absentia, meaning even if the Jews had fled to another part of Spain or to France or elsewhere, they would try them in absentia, burn their effigies, and then confiscate their property. So there's an economic motive was very significant in this. By the way, there's a huge controversy among scholars whether it was primarily economic or primarily religious motivation that fueled the Inquisition. It's beyond our scope today, but if you want, you can review the lectures on a few earlier lectures we went over this. Even the graves of conversos were not safe. Once again, especially if there was money involved, the Inquisition was not above actually digging up the remains of conversos and burning them in an auto da fe after death. So it was really a horrific kind of decision that had consequences for decades, even centuries. So this was not an especially palatable option, but neither were the others. The other option, second option, would be to flee to other Jewish communities. And of course, this is the starting point for what we'll discuss in February and onward, looking at the Sephardic diaspora. But we have to appreciate the degree of displacement this means. The Jews had lived in Spain now for, by known recorded historical data, about 1.5 millennium. By comparison, we've only lived in the New World for at most 400 years, at the outmost 400 years. And most of our families have only been here for about a century or so. So to imagine living in a place with your family for 1,500 years, with legends that stretch it back even further, to uproot them from that land is overwhelming. Furthermore, Jews were very well integrated into those societies. From the Andalusian period through the Christian period, Jews had a tremendous place in the Iberian Peninsula. So to simply pick up and leave behind their wealth, because they were not allowed to take landed wealth, they were not allowed to take gold, silver, jewelry, and so on, it's incredible. The parallels, once again, to Germany are very apparent, very stark. And just like many German Jews felt, if we just keep our heads down and this will all blow over, many Spanish Jews felt the same. So fleeing to other Jewish communities is a very difficult choice, but nevertheless, many Jews chose it. And the third possibility, which is really a subset of two, is, well, what about if we start all over? What if we go to the New World? Maybe America is anders. Maybe America will be different. As I quote the Friedricher Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, says, America is nicht anders. Very important statement. America is not different. We can live here the same way. Anyways, so let's look at some of those options. And so now, crypto-Judaism, I mentioned a little bit of this. I just want to kind of force this point a little bit more. This is a 19th century portrait by Shmuel Hirschenberg that shows Uriel da Costa and young Spinoza. It's a fanciful portrait. They probably never met. In fact, I don't think they were contemporaries of each other. But the idea that Hirschberg wants to get over in his art here is the idea that this man, Uriel da Costa, somehow foreshadowed Spinoza. And Spinoza, of course, is significant in a Jewish context because of his religious theories that were excoriated with a formal ban by the Jews of Amsterdam, and contributed in a major way to the decline of theism in the modern period. Beyond our scope, but maybe we'll look at it, God willing, in the spring. Anyways, who was Uriel da Costa? He's much less famous than Spinoza. Uriel da Costa was a Portuguese Jew. I believe he was third generation converso, meaning his grandparents had originally converted to Christianity. And so he was a grandchild who grew up entirely in a Christian milieu in the 16th century. And he was always yearning for his return back to Judaism. And they had all kinds of secret rituals, and they had a private prayer book that they had written, and all kinds of things that were, trying to keep their Jewish rituals intact. Then Da Costa and his mother managed to leave Lisbon, and they settled in Amsterdam, and he came, as it were, out of the closet and said, okay, ich bin a Yid, I'm very proud to be Jewish, let me practice my Judaism. And he was very shocked to learn that the Judaism he encountered in Amsterdam was quite different than the Judaism he had anticipated in his mind. Because we're talking about, remember, 3 generations of subterranean practice with lots of forced attendance at church and lots of education. And he had imagined Judaism in a way that was simply not it wasn't congruent with Jewish realities and Jewish theology. And he was deeply upset. He actually got into trouble several times. He probably suffered from a certain amount of mental illness on his own, but he got into trouble several times with the local rabbinical figures in Amsterdam. He was a prolific writer, so he wrote about his complaints. He wrote about how this is not the Judaism that we should be practicing. Ultimately, and he was excommunicated 3 times. The 3rd time was, he wrote about it in a very, very powerful, moving note, or a small book that was actually his suicide note. I believe Exemplar Vitae Humanae, I think was the title in Latin, Example of a Human Life, in which in order to gain forgiveness from the community, he was required to undergo a ritual humiliation, which, as he writes, he had to kneel or prostrate himself at the opening to the synagogue, the door of the synagogue, and all the members of the synagogue had to walk over his back to formally ritually humiliate them. We're not exactly sure that actually happened. That's what he wrote about, and it's not something that you would see typically in the Jewish excommunication rituals and so on. I have a lecture on it that you can see online if you like in much greater detail. But at any rate, after he experienced this, he went home, he wrote this 12-page note, which was later published, and then he shot himself. So the life of crypto-Judaism was extremely difficult, even if they managed to get out of Spain or Portugal and try to re-enter the Jewish world. Because if we're talking 3-4 generations after the Inquisition, their idea of Judaism is not the same as it was for Bobby and Zaidi. Very, very difficult re-entry into the Jewish world. The flight, of course, went all across the Mediterranean basin and up along the northern coast of Europe as well. I'll just highlight a few main points of departure where Jews had significant impact. North Africa, of course, the Sephardic Jews joined already existing communities in places like Fez, Morocco, shown here. This is the synagogue there, and had a very heavy influence on the development of Jewish society in North Africa, places like Algeria, Morocco, Libya, and so on. A place that I spent a tremendous amount of time researching, I actually wrote a book about this, Sfat in Israel. It was a major landing spot for Jews from Spain and Portugal. In particular, the burgeoning school of Kabbalists that eventually in the 16th century, formed the nucleus of a remarkable renaissance of Jewish thought that included such greats, all Sephardic and Portuguese Jews, like Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the first codifier of Kabbalah, What he did, what Rabbi Yosef Karo did for halacha, Rabbi Moshe Karo did for Kabbalah. His student, the great Arizal, who is the progenitor of the Hasidic movement, the intellectual progenitor. The Alshich, great biblical commentator. I mean, it was an amazing period where in this little town in northern Israel suddenly blossomed with these great minds, all coming from this Spanish-Portuguese milieu. Istanbul, probably the most important institutional center of Sephardic Jewry, a place where you had the first organized resistance to the persecution of Jews of Spain and Portugal, where Sephardic Jews began to organize themselves as a global community. The great Chida, Reb Chaim David Azulai, who wrote a tremendous amount of works, he was based in Istanbul, and he was one of the first people to begin making global treks. He made 2 major European circuits collecting money for Sephardic Jews in Israel, and this was really the onset of global organization of Jews to a degree that we never had before. The Ashkenazim never had anything similar. They actually, much of what we have, the Alliance Israelite and later the Federation movement and so on, owes quite a bit to the initial organizational works of the Sephardic diaspora. Ferrara, Italy, very important center for, in particular, women. And I'm very grateful that next semester, we'll be able to speak about some of these great Sephardic women, because they're hard to find in the Iberian Peninsula themselves. But some women exercised their political muscle because they were landed individuals with a tremendous amount of wealth, like Doña Gracia Mendes. They established huge publishing ventures, taking advantage of the printing press, which was a new technology that was the internet of the 16th century, and really began to reassert a Sephardic identity in a way that was extremely beneficial to the survival of this ethnic group. Amsterdam, of course, we spoke very briefly about Spinoza. This is the northern European city where so many Jews went and created a Sephardic enclave that was also kind of like a free-thinking enclave, and very much shaped the culture that pertains to Amsterdam today. Also very much involved in its commercial enterprises, which associated them with this city here in New York. So you've got this massive diaspora of Sephardic Jews that has tremendous influence, and we begin to see the burgeoning reality of a modern multinational Sephardic identity. Finally, in the New World, they originally are concentrated, of course, in Latin America and in Central America. We do have a scattering, a small gathering of Sephardic Jews who make it to New York, refugees from the Inquisition in Brazil, bringing themselves up here to New York, where they were originally sent away by Stuyvesant, who didn't want to have Jews enter here, and he was later forced to accept them. Actually, I can tell you a funny story. I was walking with my 13-year-old. We went to a Hachnasas Sefer Torah. Someone commissioned the writing of a Sefer Torah, and I'm sure all of you are aware that when a Sefer Torah is finished and is dedicated and given to a synagogue, there's a big block party, and people, march along with music, and bring it to the synagogue. So we're walking along to get to the party, and one of the streets we have to walk along was called Stuyvesant. And my son was trying to spell it out because it's one of these weird Danish spellings or Dutch spellings. And I explained to him who it was named after and the whole story. And then on the way back, as we're dancing with the Torah, my son to me says, "Isn't it ironic, Abba, that on a street called Stuyvesant, here we are dancing with the Torah?" So I think he's going to be a great historian one day. Anyway, the New World promises, of course, to have tremendous future for the Sephardic Jews, and they were the prime those who established communities here in the Northeast and also in Georgia. God willing, next semester we'll speak about them. So to wrap it up, and maybe to make that train home on time, this semester we have spent a lot of time looking at this remarkable ethnic group of Jews in the Spanish Peninsula. We began looking at them under the Visigoths when we saw just tremendous persecution, we couldn't, hard to even imagine the kind of amputations and cruelties the Jews were subject to in the Visigothic period. And then with the advent of the Muslims in the 8th century, you begin this flourishing of an unusual period of coexistence, the convivencia, that actually allowed Jews to participate in a remarkable way in secular culture to a degree to which we haven't seen elsewhere in Jewish history, not even here in America, where you have, for example, Shmuel HaNagid, who is writing a Talmudic commentary, and at the same time he's serving as the top general of a Muslim army for 16 years. And you have people who are at the top of their game in secular culture, Yehuda Halevi, the Maimonides, of course, the great eagle, and at the same time really expressing a deep commitment to Judaism and making a contribution to the Jewish future. This is the kind of Sephardic ideal that we see in this period. Of course, that unravels with the Reconquista, and even though you still have some remarkable figures in the Christian period, Abraham Zakuta is one of them, Don Yitzhak Abravanel and others, ultimately it culminates in the expulsion, but the beginning of a new chapter. As we say, God closes one door, he opens another one. We see the resilience of the Sephardim in the modern world. So God willing, I hope that you all have a great break from these lectures, and you can binge watch the old ones on YouTube if you like. We'll rejoin, God willing, in early February with a series on the Sephardic diaspora up to the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attendance.